Yeah, I like this backstage green room thing going on.
There's a story behind that sweater, isn't there?
Hi,
Claire.
Jose.
Oh, I hear
You
an
should
echo.
be in the audience. Have I sent out the wrong link?
Quick, get me out! Morning.
I'll email you.
Thank you. Bye.
What have I done? Hello, Sue. There we are. It's all shared everywhere.
Do we, since this is a 3D podcast, do we start with introducing?
You can introduce it. I have sent out the wrong link.
Yep.
Who have I sent it to? Hello, Simon.
Hello.
I've sent you the wrong link. Did you get it through the community?
I got an email from you
This just now.
just now, yeah.
Well, we've got people with us. That's all right, isn't it, team?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I just,
Hello,
as long as they
Simon.
know that they're in the show.
Hello, Lizzie. Let's go. Introduce it how you like, Shani.
How is everyone?
Okay.
Hi, Lizzie.
Welcome. You, Lizzie, you may not know, but you're actually in the show. You're welcome to turn your camera on or leave it off as you see fit. So, all right, let's welcome everyone to this the Coaching In. My name is Shani Crawford. I'm the host for this show, a guest host. And I'd like to introduce our two guests, Claire Pedrick and Oscar Trimboli. And perhaps each of you could spend a moment just introducing yourselves.
Go on, Oscar. You go first.
Oh, all right.
G'day, I'm Oscar Trimboli. I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world.
Thank you, Oscar. And Claire?
Follow that. I'm Claire Pedrick. And I just love supporting people to have better conversations, which is about listening, asking great and simple questions.
Mm-hmm. My name is Shani Crawford. I'm a head of a school in Japan, and I am a huge, huge fan of both Claire and Oscar. And I introduced them to each other, which resulted in the first podcast where Claire and Oscar spoke about listening, which then was followed by a second podcast where the three of us talked about listening, and we listened to the feedback from the first podcast. And now we're in the third podcast where I'm hosting, and I'm a little bit nervous, I should say, but I think we're in good hands here. I would like to open the conversation by bringing Why don't we mute?
Could the person on the train just mute? Thank you.
Go. Okay. So in the previous episode, the second episode, Oscar said, "I wonder what we still don't know." And the two of you are world-class experts on listening, but probably there's still something you don't know about listening. I don't know what it is, but I'm wondering if that will maybe come out of today's talk. So my goal for this episode is for us to co-create some new knowledge about listening, to push the two of you off your comfortable edges, and last time we talked about, or I believe it's Oscar talked about this idea of the washing machine, and that we, by talking things out, we can sort of pull out little bits of laundry and see what we've got here, and see what comes of it. That's my thinking for the start of this. And so my first question is to the two of you, to say that we're going to try to create meaning in this shared space. So what do we each need to bring to this podcast, to this space, to make it fertile for new discoveries about listening?
Great question. Courage, I think, because Oscar had this great plan that this is going to be live with an audience. So that requires a different level of courage, doesn't it, from doing it as a recording?
Absolutely.
And yeah, openness. That's my two.
Courage and openness. Oscar?
Shani, who's we in your question?
Well, I wasn't expecting to have the extra guests in the podcast, but Claire has decided to send out the link to everyone to join the podcast. So we actually have a few extra members here, and I'm very happy to invite them into the conversation too, if we think that's a good way to proceed.
I guess it was more about, in response to your question, is we the three of us, or is it the audience, or is it the audience present live? Is it the audience present listening after the fact? So that's my curiosity about your question.
I was thinking the three of us. What do we, the three of us, need to do, or what do we need to bring to make sure we bring our best selves to the conversation and can co-create some new knowledge?
Yeah, so for me, it's the intention that the we is more than the three of us, and that I have an intention that is embracing of the system we know, whoever's logging in and whoever's listening, and whoever might listen to this in the future and get it passed on from somebody else. So yeah, apologies for the clarifying question.
No, not at all. That's what we're here for. Clarifying is part of being a good listener, as far as I understand. So if we're going to co-create new knowledge about listening, we have some questions from the audience that we can go to. But before that, I wonder if there are any questions that the two of you think we might want to explore together today.
I have a question. I suppose it's an inquiry that came up after I listened to the last mighty episode that Oscar, you kindly edited together. So as I was listening to it, there was a moment when you and I switched position. And you said, Claire looks different. She's done, she's changed this, she's this, she's the other. I didn't like myself before that bit because I never listen back to podcasts where I'm a guest. And at the I was behaving more like a guest than a host at the beginning of the thing. And I thought, did I switch my listening on? That was my inquiry. Did I switch my listening on? And since then, this is the Claire coming out live stream. I've discovered that I'm neurodivergent. And I didn't know that before. So that's new knowing. And when I listened as a listener to that episode, I wonder whether I did switch my listening on. And that is just a really interesting inquiry that I'm sitting with. So I was excited about joining you two to talk about it, as well as lots of other things.
Yeah, so, and you've showcased the hardest position in listening is the speaker.
Say more.
The speaker is in flow, trying to get a series of words out. And the speaker's attention, I talk about two types of attention: give and pay attention, which we kind of talked about in the book, and then attention in and attention out. Attention in is thinking about me, my words, and dealing with whatever I'm dealing with in the moment. And on stage, if you were doing public speaking, it might show up as nervousness, it might show up as extreme confidence, but your attention is on you. Whereas when your attention is out as a speaker, you'll be checking in. How's this landing with the listener? And it's a massive piece of work to operate at a consciousness where you're speaking your 125 words and your 125 words and your 125 words, and noticing how those words are landing. People often quite shocked, particularly in environments like this, where you can see synchronized nods in the group, and to not notice that that's the moment where your idea, your sentence, your metaphor lands does a great disservice to the group, because you're speaking, but you're not listening to them. And everybody thinks that there's a speaker position and a listener position, but it's actually a simultaneous equation, and you're changing positions extraordinarily rapidly. And people think, oh, I'm in listening mode right now. I'm in speaking mode right now. It's like, this is why, if you're congruent with yourself, your true self, it's easy because you don't have your attention in. There's a balance. So as I say that, I'm curious how that's landing for you, Claire. And then I'm going to pop over to Shani. And Shani, my question to you will be, when I said the hardest position in listening is the speaker, I'm curious what came to mind for you, but I'm curious for Claire, because you're the one who said, say more.
Of course, I got captivated by the bit that interested me the most. If I show the working out on that, because I think there's something in coaching about that moment when it lands. And I spent a lot of time exploring with people that artful moment, because that's the moment of sharing, isn't it? That's the moment where we pass it over and we let go and we let the thing do its good work. It needs a long walk, Oscar. That's the truth. It's one of those things where you go, oh yeah. Because as much as we say listening is a two-way street, you've just described it in a completely different way. That's making me think differently. But it's a work in progress. Thank you.
Before we go to Shani, and I don't want to take over hosting, please, in the chat, what's landing for you when Oscar says the speaker's position is the most difficult part of listening? Shani, you've had a bit of think time. I'm curious.
I have, but it's kind of overwhelming trying to listen and keep up and and think of what to say. But yes, I had the same reaction as Claire, which is, okay, I need to hear more when you said that the most difficult position is the speaker. Because as you said, it sounds like it's the we're talking about listening here, so it should be the listener. So then, and having participated in Claire's coaching training, we talk a lot about this idea of having to, as the coach, having to pay attention to what the speaker is saying, but the coach is the listener in that position. So I'm trying to get that into my head, this idea that the speaker needs to pay attention as well as the listener needs to pay attention. So that's not just a two-way street. It's a super highway.
Yeah, and a lot of the time when I work with people, it's like when they've mastered and are conscious of level 4 and 5 in the listening model, it is then time for me to reveal to them that beyond that is knowing that there are 3 positions in every conversation: the speaker position, the listener position, and the dialogue. The dialogue is its own entity. The dialogue has its own depth, distance, and direction. And if we're not conscious of that, we're in a polarity or a binary, and we treat the other as the speaker rather than a counterpart or a thinking partner. They don't want listening from us. It's like, I know it's hard for me to say that out aloud. They don't. They want progress. That's what they're there for. That's what they're contracting from us. And if you're conscious of that third position, your orientation is out rather than in. Claire's
Yeah, I often
busted.
describe that as the space between us. I love what you're describing there. And it jumps me into thinking about the difference between dialogue when both of us have an equal part of the conversation and whatever the other thing is that we might call it, which is a coaching conversation, for example, where one of us is there to facilitate the processing of the other, and there's a different equity in the conversation than there is in a dialogue. So I wonder whether that space between is a slightly, I don't know, different shape, different something.
Yeah.
And should it be?
That's a really good question.
It should be guided by the opening contract or invitation, whether that's a coaching contract or in a workplace conversation between a peer and a peer, superior and a subordinate, whatever it is. And it's always as simple as what will make this a good conversation. That's the entity. That's the dialogue. So we're not asking what will make it a good conversation for you, Claire. That's not the question. We're not actually interested in Claire's perspective. We're interested in, because we come together, we're co-creating something, and it may or may not need to go in a direction, but it needs to be acknowledged that that third entity is where the work is for both of us.
Lovely.
Claire, I'm not sure if you had a chance to run your eye down the chat. Got some contributions from Sue and Simon.
Lovely comment from Sue. Brings to mind a coaching conversation I was in the other day, and I was summarizing the other person's thinking, and it seemed suddenly irrelevant and sounded in my head like an unnecessary echo. That is so beautifully phrased, Sue. I thought I could have stayed with listening instead, so they could have listened to themselves. Beautiful. What struck you, Oscar?
I just love the fact that we're on a technology where we can have those who are participating with their presence to share what's landing. And again, if you're ever hosting webinars or workshops in an online environment, just facilitate as many tools to have the dialogue two-way, not because of the host. A good host gets everybody to listen to the active speaker. A great host gets everybody to listen to each other. That's why it's so critical to share in the chat. So as peers, we can learn and we can create and move the dialogue that we're having in a direction that's productive for the group as well.
Do we want to comment some more on Sue's comment in the chat?
The unnecessary echo. That's such a beautiful phrase. Have you ever thought of it like that, Oscar? Have you ever described it as an unnecessary echo? It's beautiful.
I'm guessing that's Sue, the poet.
Ah.
Sue, is it Sue F, the poet? Because I think that just brings to life the distinction we were talking about earlier on, is your attention in or attention out. And I speculate in that moment with Sue, her attention was in, but it resulted in her speaking out aloud. If her attention was out on the other, she may have noticed the things that you notice, Claire, in what's happening here and what's happening in the tilt of the head and where's the exhale coming from. Because there's so much people will give you if you're just conscious to it. I think the other reflection I'd make on Sue is just her awareness that it happened in the moment, which is great. Which means next time you probably will adopt a different orientation. Well done.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the words, because those are the kind of words that are easy to remember. And we can all go, was that an unnecessary echo?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sue.
It's going to show up in Claire's new book. So
Credited.
credited, of course.
We'll see who could get it into a book first, right, Oscar?
Yeah, my next book's in a very different direction. So yeah, over to you and Sue.
Shall we look at Josephine's comment? I've only got a dancing analogy as words fail. Might we be back to dancing when we speak and listen? When we are truly present, the flow flows. The third element might be the music, which has its own voice.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
So when you don't just have the two dancers, but you've got the music as a third party to the dance.
And going back to what you said, Oscar, about what we see, I interviewed a composer, musician last week, and he was talking about the breath that you just mentioned, Oscar, and really seeing, hearing, sensing the quality of breathing as part of the thing that's in this third space. Nice.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to look at Lizzie's comment? Never taken that thought about the speaker has so much to do, yet it has been on my mind. It has been brought to my conscience. Oh, thank you. Somebody's posting it in the... I love the reminder that there's always at least 3 parts of the conversation. It's been on my mind since you mentioned it in the other book. Ask the person and ask about the person and the dialogue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, when you come to work with your supervisor, it's very difficult to have a consciousness with your attention out if you haven't done the work to work on yourself first. Because for a lot of your listening and speaking, it will come filtered through whatever you're being triggered by, whatever you're reflecting on, instead of pausing and noticing and then simply asking this question, which is the question I ask myself: is what I'm offering for me, for them, or for the dialogue? You know, that agreed contract, what will make this a good conversation? If I can't answer the third, I don't contribute, because it's not going to progress us. It may progress me and it may progress them, but it may not progress us. And that's where conversations and questions, remember, questions have depth and direction, and they also have distance. They can create great distance from the initial starting position, because a well-constructed, useful question for the purpose will be transformational rather than a transactional inquiry about some kind of content we're dealing with in the moment.
So I have a question as a very new person to this whole field. Then you're saying that if it's not, if the question or the next thing isn't directed at this third entity in the space, then you don't say it. You don't go there at all. But is there ever a time when you do, when you should or you need to say something for yourself or say something that is meant for the other person rather than for progressing the conversation?
It depends where you are in your coaching journey. If we're talking in the coaching context here, Shani, that's definitely not where I started, but working into different, in a group supervision model and a one-on-one supervision model, that's when I realized that what am I actually contracting for, as opposed to, oh, I've come to realize there's a power differential here, and if I can make myself sound really smart with a question, but that's attention in, and it's all about me. But there were lots of times where I asked those questions, particularly when I work with leaders in very logical professions, actuaries, accountants, lawyers, engineers, software developers. Their world to me is just completely fascinating, and sometimes I have no idea what they're actually talking about. And in the early days, because my attention's like, well, I don't know what they're talking about. How can I be helpful? I better ask a question to make myself sound good. Whereas now, I can simply ask a question that says, you mentioned that we spoke about this being a good conversation. Are they still connected given how far we've moved? Right. So that's how I would join the dots there. It's a progression, Shani. It's definitely not something you can switch on and off, because it's about state management again by your presence. And that's the work we need to do as coaches.
So are you saying that again, I'm very new to this, so, and I'm hoping that this is valuable to the audience as well, but the kind of question that is in this third space is literally just about moving the conversation forward. Nothing like that. That's the key.
Or the question could be, we're 20 minutes in, we initially said, this is what we've purpose of the conversation. How are we going? Right? Mm-hmm. So that's a question that's still roughly in that direction, but it's a recontracting question to go, are we on track, off track? The other question I ask with, say, 20 minutes to go in a 1 hour schedule is simply this: given the time remaining, is there anything we need to adjust? And then the final question is always, what's different in your thinking and feeling since we started today? Because that's the only question you need to know, because then you'll know the progress they've made. Occasionally you may ask a numeric question, like on a scale of 1 to 10 at the beginning, a scale of 1 to 10 at the end, and you can dance around with that. What about for you, Claire?
Can I just interrupt and say, just like Lizzie says, this is Claire. This is Claire's exact code for coaching, which maybe Oscar doesn't realize, but anyone who knows Claire is like, yeah. These are her actual words.
Okay.
I think if we talk about this third space, this dialogue, you might have heard me talking about it, Shani, as the work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think as you were talking, Oscar, I think you enabled me to just reframe slightly one of my discomforts about coach training, which is that it's about the facilitator of the conversation learning to do a lot of things, and it's very rarely about how that is connected or received or engaged with by the other person, who I would call the thinker. And isn't it interesting when you hear something that you've kind of thought of, but you hear somebody saying it in a different way? You there are times like just now when you think, that's why it's such a challenge. So it's like for me, observing a lot of coach training is like observing somebody who is massively strengthening the muscle in one leg and not exercising the other leg at all.
Mm.
And that shows up when we're doing the work, doesn't it? Because it's not about my curiosity. It's about my being able to be present as and enable someone else to be curious and for us to be curious together. But it's not about my curiosity, because we don't need to know anything. But we need to be really present, I think.
And the place I would leave it with is that the person in the conversation that's contracted as the coach is not the content expert, they're the process expert.
Yeah.
It's not the what that they're expert in, it's the how that they're expert in.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, if you have a bit of industry knowledge, a bit of empathy, or you've worked in a particular systemic set of relationships, Claire and I have done a lot of work in health, there are times where you are going to be more valuable to progress the conversation, to move out of the coach pure mode and recontract really quickly to go, hey, I've got some industry experience in this. Are you open to a bit of advice? Because that might be much more helpful to them, or not. They can choose. Like they can say, no, I'm actually rather work on my thinking right now, and maybe we'll come to that at the end, and that's fine too. But I think sometimes we need to just be open beyond the label on a business card or on a LinkedIn title to go, how can we be helpful to the dialogue? Because sometimes being a coach is the absolute wrong modality to bring for that part of the conversation.
Again, that's about ethics and all of the ethics that go behind that. Because for that to be true, that needs to be ethical, right? And I think it can be tempting to offer when it's an opinion, not a deeply embedded experience, knowing. Whatever.
But the choice is always with them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So we've gotten about halfway through our time together.
Nice check-in, Shady.
And we got a lot of questions beforehand.
We do. So I just want to ask, where are we now? And are we where we should be? Is there anything we need to do to get ourselves?
Well, and also that's a check-in for those who are present live as well. Anything you want to loop back on from the last 30 minutes before we move on to the questions that were shared?
Mm-hmm.
I'm good.
Claire?
I'm good too.
Mm-hmm.
Loving your cat.
I'm sorry, she's the people who are listening to this as a podcast maybe aren't seeing it, but maybe they're hearing several things falling on my desk because I'm trying to get her to not interrupt. Shall we then go on to the questions, and perhaps Oscar can post the link in the chat so that people who are joining us can vote. Thank you, Oscar, for doing that. On the question that they might like to hear the answer to the most. And I believe we'll get I've got it open here on my screen. We'll get a live update on what people are voting on.
Nice.
Oh, now I'm not seeing. How about if we just start with one of the questions for now? Is that okay? I will just pick one of the questions then, if that's okay. So in the last session, we talked about the backstory. And this is one of the questions. What role do you think the backstory has in coaching? And I think that's an interesting one because in some senses, as we were just saying, you don't need to know the backstory. But are there some cases when you do? and how
Shall
the
I
backstory
start?
helps. Yes, please, Claire.
I think for me, it's about how, if you're going to do it, it's about who's it's serving. Because if it's serving me, then it's not a great plan, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's how do we do it? So I think often I hear the backstory being investigated by the coach. So it's like going backwards. And as information in the backstory is emerging, the coach is asking for more information, or the thinker is offering more information. And all that's happened is there has been a gathering of information. I don't think that backstory style works. However, sometimes it's useful to look at what's happened before. And for me, this doing that in the past. So we do that by saying, as you think about the past, or as you talk about what's gone before, what do you notice? So it's about noticing together today the things that may have been true before. And the things that we notice are rarely the facts. The things that we notice are often the feelings or the nuances or the mood or the whatever. And I think that if we're going to do that, and if that's going to be useful, we have to be very cautious about our stance. So so the only work that we can do is in the present. So if we're going to explore the backstory, it needs to be today, and we need to be standing today looking at what we notice. Yeah, that would be my take.
I think of backstory as Rubik's Cube. The first face of the Rubik's Cube is the backstory. The next face of the Rubik's Cube is their backstory. And then there's a third position, is their place in the backstory. And I would still converge where Claire is to get them to notice themselves. Is that story useful, productive? Is it making them angry? But just, what does this story mean now? And what does this story mean going forward? Because a lot of the time, just by telling the story, that's the first time they've had a container to express it. And they might not care after that. I remember, and I think I got into the book, where somebody just vomited on me for best part of 25 minutes. But at the 12-minute mark, there was a breath that I noticed. There was this long pause, and then they continued with a vomit. Now, bear in mind, they told me they were going to vomit all over me, and they just wanted to get it out. And I simply said, what changed when you did this? And I just took their breath. And they was like, oh, I was so sick of my excuses. I realized that I'd made a decision at that point that I'm not going to make any more excuses. I'm just going to get on with it, but I had to get the rest out. So the backstory didn't serve them from that point on. That backstory was just a launching pad for, okay, what's that? What do we do going forward now? But they never had a chance to release it, because that story was an anchor for them. It wasn't a springboard.
A technical question, Oscar.
Mm.
When you're listening to that vomit, I love how you really notice the breath. If you were to map it, how much are you listening to the content and how much are you listening to the mood? Yeah, I thought you were going to say that. Me too.
Zero.
Me too.
There was a clock behind my client, and I was completely zoned in on the clock, because she said, I'm going to go for at least 25 minutes. And I was like, fine. And again, she just needed to say it out loud. I just happened to be a witness in the room. And honestly, she could have recorded it as a voice memo into her phone and sent it to me, and it would have had the same impact for her. So I'm not that arrogant to think that I created the breath at the 12-minute mark. I was just there going, what's happening with her state? Because in the first half, the physical movement of her spine and her head and her shoulders and her hands were incredibly more animated. After that breath, it moved from all of this to very simple, shorter hand movements. They were infrequent. The pausing between words was more deliberate. You could see there was a consciousness shift, not just in the words. I didn't really care, but it was driven by the body shape as far as I could tell.
And that's a safety thing, isn't it? Because that's how I work. And it means that I don't take anything in. I was talking to someone the other day, and the world they coach in, they get a lot of vomiting. And they were so released to discover that they didn't have to find the work in the vomit. I said, whatever's in the vomit is almost 99.9% surely not the work. The question is what is noticed in the emergence from that, or what is noticed in it, but not what's the content in it. And she went, oh, but I've always listened. I meant to listen. I listen deeply. And I said, and I'm guessing that's not healthy for you. And it also means that you've decided that that's the work. And actually that might be the thing they need to release before you get to the work.
Yeah. I think the only time I would say that it was important for me to notice the content was when somebody made a revelation that they were raped by their uncles as a teenager, and you know, the story didn't go much further than that because I had to check in on them really, really rapidly. And they said, look, I've never told this story before, but I trust you. And I said, yeah, I get that you do, but that's not what we're here for. I need to provide you with the kind of support that this kind of trauma requires. I'm happy to check in with you, but right now we need to check in on this story, and this story is not what we're contracted to, and I need to help to get the right kind of support for you right now, and that's not me. And it was really interesting because it was about a year later that he came back to me, and he just said to me, why was it you that I told after 35 years? And I said, again, that's a question for the person you're working with. If you want to go forward in the work coaching context, just confirm with your therapist that you're okay to go now. And he did, and they said he wasn't. So there was still work for him to do. So sometimes as coaches, we're not the right modality to support them. So just be cautious of that.
Yeah. That is very much a big part of Claire's coaching training, about knowing when you're the right person and when you're not as a coach.
Yeah.
There's the
But
question
I think
in the sorry.
Just to really very briefly build on that, I think that story, Oscar, reminds us that actually we have to be very boundaried at that point, because that might be the moment that they think we're the best person ever to do this with them, when actually we're really not the best. You know, we are absolutely not the best person.
So Shani, everybody's kind of voted now.
Yes, I see that. I just wanted to pick up. So the one person, Lizzie, asked, how do you know when to let it run versus ask for the value during the vomit? And so you've described a case where you need to stop the vomit, but is there something that tells you, like, is it as simple as if they're not saying something that's sort of outside of your purview, do you just let it run? Or do you ever stop it at some point?
Well, it's back to what have we contracted for? Both in the overall coaching agreement and in this case, in the context of the conversation for that period of time. Again, it's getting your orientation to the third position, not to your position or their position.
So do people tend to have the self-awareness to say, look, I just need to get this up and out?
Yeah. And I'm very pragmatic about it, which I heard you say, Oscar, about the way you work. I just say, how long do you want?
Yeah, exactly what I do. Yeah.
And, you know, is it a 5? You can often
It's
get a
never
sense.
5 minutes.
you can often get a sense of the number that it needs to be. It's 5 minutes if something's just happened, isn't it? It can be if something happened on the way, it can be quite quick. But you can get an intuitive sense of the number, and then I just offer that because there's something for me about permission, which is that we're doing things a little bit unusually. And therefore, we've got to give people a bit of a scope of what's allowed in this space. So I would say 20 minutes. And I wouldn't speak in the 20 minutes because I might say, any more? If it looked like they'd finished and it was unclear, but I probably wouldn't put a pause in the middle because whose pause is it? Yeah.
Yeah, and just to close the loop on that conversation and connect the dots with an awesome episode that was recorded about note taking, I take 0 notes, and I'm really comfortable with that.
Because it's all about connection, isn't it? And however subtle we think we're being, we're being slightly distracted and we're breaking connection. And we never needed to know the information anyway. But there is the training industry is very loud. The coaching training industry is very loud on data collection.
The battle-scarred coaches who've been doing it for decades will come to their own conclusion.
Can I ask, Oscar, I know that you're a specialist of listening in the workplace. How does this differ in the workplace? If you're a leader, for example, and somebody's coming to you with, and then this happened and then that happened, and, how much do you as a leader need to actually listen to the details?
Oh, really simple. It would have happened to me in my working life. Before they start, it's like, okay, what do you need from this conversation? That's my version of what will make it a good conversation. Because it's not my job to help them. Right? It's not my job to help them. It's my job to make sure they got the resources to progress. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say blah, blah, blah in that first, what do you need from this conversation? And I'll go, great. If that's what you need from the conversation, next Tuesday, we've got our one-on-one. That's going to be a more appropriate time where I'm ready for the conversation. Or I would have said, you know what? I think this is a conversation that requires you, me, and the third person, because it's always the third person, right? And then, are you okay with that? And 9 out of 10 times, yeah, it makes sense. And then I go, great. Is there a reason for me to be there with the third person? And they'll go 9 times out of 10, no. And 1 out of 10, yeah, which is okay. But again, it's the consciousness to go, it's what resource is helpful for their outcome, not for them, not for me, not, for me to rescue them or help them. It's not my job to do that. It's in the workplace. It's checking in really quickly, right Okay, blah, 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 vomit. Okay, great. What do you need from the next 5 minutes? Because that's literally all I got. Park it to a one-on-one, park it to a meeting tomorrow where it's just an exclusive meeting. You've got to be quite nimble at that point to go, them vomiting in the corridor about the issue, about a co-worker or about a restructure, about a system or a process is not helpful for anybody, least of all them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's create a container where that can be made productive for them and the issue. That's how I did it in the workplace.
And do you find that putting that pause in between them wanting to vomit and them being given the space, does that change things? Just the time without even the conversation having happened?
I think it depends where they're at in their level of adult development. There'll be some people where it won't make any difference at all, and there'll be some people where they've got a consciousness for self-reflection and self-awareness. So they may cancel the meeting, they may reduce the size of the meeting, they may go, I've thought about it. And then your first question is, well, what options have you thought about? So you're not trying to fix those. And my favorite question was always, what options have you ruled out? Because often it was the ones they ruled out because I was like, I couldn't get that over because I don't have enough political capital with Division B to get it over the line. The sales organization will never buy that, the engineering organization. But that just signaled to me there was work I needed to do with them. The issue wasn't sales or marketing or engineering. The issue was self-confidence, or the issue was their story that they were telling themselves in terms of identity. And I didn't have all those labels to put on them back in those days, but I just knew that somebody who's like in a negotiation and it's like, I need to go on negotiation training. It's like, no, we need to understand what conflict means for you, because they didn't have a concept of productive conflict. They only had a concept of negative conflict as an example. So in the workplace, there's lots of pivots you need to do, even change the modality. Sometimes it may be a phone call where I had somebody in my team who was interstate. They would call me when I started in my role once a day for the first 3 weeks. And eventually I said, what? Why are you calling me every day? I trust you. And they said, well, my last manager wanted me to do it. It's like, okay, what else could you be doing with this 20 minutes that you're driving home instead of calling me? Because it's not helpful for you, is it? This is like, great. I thought that's just the way this company did it. No. There are rituals that have hangovers, and sometimes you have to question them as a leader.
Right. Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes and we've still got 6 more questions. So is it okay if we look at the first one together, which is, what has been your listening journey and what has changed over time?
I think for me, everything's changed over time. The more I've studied and researched and practiced, I know less than I did when I started. I was looking up a research paper published in 1952 the other day, and it's like, it was so elegant in its simplicity. It was very clear, and it's like so many reams and reams and reams and reams of research has been written by academics. And this paper was only 10 pages, and yet it's kind of the seminal work in listening. And I always kind of go, you try and get too fancy pants, Oscar, you better get back to, white belt, where we were talking about the different belts in practice. So my journey's taken a very meandering path, but the journey and where I'm at looking forward right now is I know less now about listening than when I started.
Claire?
So I'm in tectonic plate shifting world at the moment. So I'll speak from the present. I mean, I have learnt that my work listening is a hyper focus for me, and that there's always more to learn in that space. But I'm also noticing that the gap between how I listen at work and how I listen everywhere else is bigger.
Mm.
Me too.
So that's kind of interesting. And I've got so many questions now about how I do what I do. Like, I look more than I hear. No, I hear, well, hearing and listening are interesting, aren't they? Because I think they're slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So I will pay much more attention to the visual than I do to the auditory in a conversation. And when the visual isn't clear enough, I'll close my eyes so that I can see better. But it is an endless, it's just a beautiful, endless journey of discovery and uncovering. And I love these conversations that we have together because they provoke me to look into different spaces and to look differently and to consider things that I hadn't considered before, because we only know what we know. We only feel what we feel until we feel or know something else, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just the final bit for me, journey-wise, is to make any kind of progress, there is parts I have to unlearn or leave behind, and that's the work of it for me. It's not the knowledge or the framework or the model or the more practice. It's like, what have I got to leave behind in stale old practices that I absorbed in the past and not even conscious of? And again, that's why I'd encourage everyone into some kind of supervision where you can have your supervisor or peer supervisors helping you to notice that as well.
Mm-hmm. So, where are we? Where did we get to in this conversation? And did we meet our goal at all of trying to push our edges?
Well, I'm just curious, given that there's a range of questions we haven't got to, do we want to record responses to that after the fact, or do we want to do a high level touch on each of those? Where would the audience like us to go? I think that would be a good invitation for the chat. It's like, do you want us
Or
to
shall
explore
we meet again?
Is this a series? Is this the third in a series of 10 podcasts?
Yeah, that's a good third option as well. So I think we asked this question at the end of the last discussion, Shani. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to invite the group to direct us where they want us to go with this. Please, in the chat, share what's top of mind.
So we've got to do this again,
I'm happy
please.
to come back for another one.
Now we've learnt about live streaming, right?
Yes.
There's an overwhelming vote for do it again. There you are.
Yes, I think just speaking from my own perspective, having the two of you in a room together, riffing off each other, is just magic. And so I would be very, very happy to play a part in this happening again, if there's any way for me to do that.
What do you think, Oscar?
As we said when we first met, Claire, this is an experiment and we have no idea. We're just data collectors in a science experiment. And we're the test tubes. And we mix together occasionally, see what happens.
Yeah.
On the last slide, we'd love to just hear what you're going to apply from today. What's one thing you're taking away from today? It'd be great for you to just put a word or two or a sentence or two in the Menti and see there, or in the chat if you're listening on other platforms, just so we can see and listen to what you heard today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking to see if there's any comments on YouTube. Safe and edgy, says Joe's.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Enjoy when presence is real and note what makes it so that I can find out, so that I can find more. There's something, isn't there, about how in listening we have to be absolutely truly ourselves, and how that can be difficult sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when we can do that, that is a beautiful thing.
Mm.
So a piece about leaving things behind from Lizzie. Lovely.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, shall we wrap up? It just turned the hour here. Oh, and my alarm is going just to tell us that. Sorry about that. Shall we wrap things up here and possibly promise that this could happen again? Stay
Definitely.
tuned.
Definitely. And we'll manage the live stream better next time.
It's all an adventure. It's all an experiment. No failure, just learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Oscar. And we will see you next time.
Bye-bye. Fab. Come out, Lizzie.